I'd like to introduce and have Kai Liefeld come up and kick off with with our panel. We have a great panel this morning on a topic that's obviously based on attendance of great interest to y'all about shareholder activism and how you're dealing with that at your boards. But Kai is the V&E partner, and he leads their shareholder activism practice. Kai, I'm going to let you come up and take it from here. So.
My name is Kai Liefeld. No one knows how to pronounce my last name. In fact, even my wife was reluctant to take my name. We are here pleased to be the warm-up program for the Astros parade later. So who do we have here today? I have a panel here full of favorites of mine. So ladies first, we have here Sydney Isaac. Her full resume, which is extraordinarily long, is in the leaflet. But Sydney is a managing director at the Abernathy McGregor Group, one of the finest financial PR firms in the country. She's the person you want to call for special situations, crisis situations, including proxy fights. And Sydney and I, we have been through a fair number of proxy fights in the past, including the defense of the W Hotel in Austin, Omega Protein here in Houston, and a few other situations, including the pending proxy fight against the Rise Energy and EQT merger. Then I have with me here Joe Zirkman. Joe Zirkman is one of the finest general counsel I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Joe was the general counsel of Fiesta Restaurant Group, that's the parent company of Taco Cabana and Pollo Tropical. They had a proxy fight earlier this year against a member of the Papas family, which is why we didn't have our speaker dinner yesterday at Papas Steakhouse. And Joe, after having to put up with me for 9 months, decided that he needs a break. So he is right now taking a break, but he is probably coming out of his sabbatical soon. So if you're looking for a new excellent general counsel, here's one for you. And then we have Bob Schweitzer. Bob Schweitzer has a resume that fills an entire page. He is one of the most amazing individuals I've ever met. A stand-up guy as they come. And in addition to his incredible resume, he actually survived a proxy fight with me last year for a company called Riseband Technology, where he served as chairman. And Bob is going to share a couple of anecdotes on that front with us as well. So the topic today is when a proxy contest is the only way to preserve long-term value. So what we are going to do is we will go through a mock proxy fight, and on the premise that there is no common ground or not enough common ground between the activists and the beliefs of the board, and we see how that plays out to give you kind of an idea, to the extent you haven't been through a proxy fight, how this all might play out. Could go to the next slide. To give you some data just to warm you up a little bit and get you sufficiently scared, I just thought I'd tell you what's going on right now in corporate America. We are actually in a record year of shareholder activism. We are on pace to have more shareholder activism campaigns in 2017 than in any other year in history of corporate America. As you will see on the right, most proxy fights are still targeting companies with a market cap of under $1 billion. That's why you don't read about a lot of proxy fights, because when a $500 million market cap company is typically not covered by the Wall Street Journal. But proxy fights are all abound, and obviously you've seen Procter Gamble, Arconic, ADP, large caps have become the focus of serious activism as well. The good news, though, is that in the last 2 years, boards who stood their ground and had the courage of their conviction to withstand activists whom they believed had the wrong path. They were pretty successful. So the success rate of activists in obtaining board seats went down in the last 2 years. And in fact, last year, in all of corporate America, 73% of the boards who actually took a proxy fight to the vote prevailed. I was involved in the last 2 years in 22 proxy fights, and we lost only 2. And my litigator still tells me, actually, we won because we saved the CEO's job in each of them. But this is just what litigators do. They always try to spin everything as a win. So let's go into the mock proxy fight. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is our fact pattern here. Fairly new hedge fund, activist capital, and in fact, when I drafted this, my initial draft called them Dodgers Capital, but I thought that was too cute. So they sent a formal letter to the board of your company. We call it America Company, very original, I know. And in that letter, Activist Capital claims to own an economic interest of 4.9% in America Company. They cite conversation with a majority of your shareholders, and they criticize you for everything under the sun, including the fact that the sun goes down at night. Activist Capital believes that the America Company should be sold immediately. Oh no, I misspoke. They should initiate a strategic review of alternatives, including a sale. Additionally, they advise that you should consider adding shareholder representatives to the board. They request an urgent meeting with the independent directors of the board. And as it turns out, and as you learn as board members, management actually had already a couple of meetings with Activist Capital, but didn't really tell you about it. So Sydney, to start things off, I mean, just help us understand and translate activism English into plain English. So when an activist says that they have an economic interest in the company, what do they typically mean?
Sure, good morning. These are pretty common terms for an initial letter like this. Economic interest, that's hard to calculate. It could be equity, it could be derivatives. Your proxy solicitor can try to help you identify what that actually means. I think the bottom line is even if they own a small share, you could still be subject to the fight. So I'd take it seriously, even if it's a small stake. They talk about strategic alternatives is another one of the phrases in here. Technically, there could be several things that they're wanting the company to look into. In reality, they want you to sell the company. Simple. And then the last kind of phrase in here, they talk about they want a shareholder representative, right? Well, they want their shareholder representative. They don't want a representative from a different shareholder. It's pretty transparent that they want themselves or one of their friends to join the board. So that's how you kind of unpack a letter like that, and this is pretty standard.
Very helpful, thank you. And you mentioned that oftentimes the economic interest composes of several different kinds of equity. So, I mean, the first question I always get from our clients when they receive a letter like that is, well, how can we find out how much the activist really owns? How much do they own in straight equity? How much are just derivatives? And the problem is that the regulatory filing system in the United States has a tremendous number of loopholes. So the 13F and 13D and 13G filings that funds make with the SEC, there are a lot of ways to circumvent them. I'll give you one example. You know that fund managers having more than $100 million in equities need to make quarterly filings called 13F. On these 13F filings, however, you need to disclose only straight equity. You don't need to disclose derivatives. And in fact, there's a little anecdote. Last year, I was in an activist situation across Starboard Value. They claimed to have an economic interest of 4.9% in the target company. September 30th approached, but Starboard really didn't want to disclose their interest in the company to continue to have private negotiations without the media spotlight shining on the situation. So they promised us prior to September 30th, look, don't worry, we're going to move everything into derivatives on September 29th, and we move it back into equity on October 1st. And in fact, a couple of days later, they gave us a call and apologized that something went wrong and accidentally a couple of shares remained in straight equity, so that actually they did show up on a 13F filing. But this long story short, there are lots of ways to hide your position, which is why you should make sure that your company's management hires a stockwatch firm. Stockwatch firms come in all shapes and sizes. They are extraordinarily useless stockwatch services, and then they are very, very helpful ones. The really bad ones, they call you either 3 days a week, calling you that Carl Icahn is in your stock and without ever showing up, or even worse, they wouldn't even see Carl Icahn when he shakes their hand. The really good ones, they have their ear on the ground. They know which fund is using which broker to hide their positions, which Cayman Island they are going to use to hide their interests, and what kind of derivatives they are using. They hear the rumors, and then they can piece it together. It's almost like private investigation work. And so when you pick stockwatch firms, don't go for the cheapest service provider. Go to someone who knows what it's doing. There are, in my experience, only four firms who really know what they're doing. Happy to provide you with names.
And Kai, if I can just say, just the fact that an activist has a relatively small position in your stock doesn't mean you can be complacent, because if they do have the ability to get their story out and get other shareholders to agree with them, then a small activist stake becomes a larger problem. So just the small size of the stake doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear.
Yeah, you don't know who their block is behind them. They could own 4.9 but have lined up 20% of the company, and hopefully you would know that in talking to your major shareholders, but maybe not.
So Bob, here, in this fact pattern, you learn as board member that management already had a number of conversations with the fund, but they didn't tell you about it. How does it make you feel, and how do you think things should have been?
Not very good. So, let me preface it by, I don't know who has been through one of these before, but trust me, if you haven't been through one, this is the best way to go through one, through a panel discussion, rather than being hit with it. It's interesting. How do you know about activism? And there's a lot of ways, there are indications. I think we as board members know the performance of the company, are concerned, and certainly probably know it better than any activist out there. But if you're not doing this, and I know you all are, make sure you're listening to the quarterly earnings call. See what questions are out there. Make sure you're looking at the ISS annual review to see what their concerns are, because the activist is going to play on that. I used to get a monthly report from an IR firm. I wanted to know, in general, not specific, the questions they were fielding and who are they coming from. Particularly important before your annual meeting. If you're running it as a board member that said the CEO, make sure you sit down with the IR firm to understand who's out there. And another thing, and this is becoming a very hot topic, make sure you have an outreach to your major investors, particularly the major institutional investors. And make sure you have an open dialogue with the CEO, because as Kai question alluded, shame on both of you if you don't know about the phone calls they're fielding.
Yeah, if I may, when an activist is becoming part of your life and management knows that that's happened, the question, I guess, from a general counsel's perspective is, when do we reach out to the board and let them know that this is happening? And the answer, I look at it this way. If I'm aware of a major lawsuit that's affecting the company, I may not pick up the phone that day and call the board. I may want to take a look at the pleadings, see what their vulnerability is, get a sense of things so that when I talk to the board, I can have a good discussion with them and get them informed. With an activist situation, you've got to get to the board. If you're the management team, you've got to let the board know immediately. And there's a bunch of reasons why that's important. One is the board is going to be very, very actively involved in this situation. Maybe not the full board, but certainly some members of the board. And it's going to take up a lot of time. Maybe the most important reason is this. The last thing that you want to happen is for a board member, an unprepared or unsuspecting board member, to get a call from an activist shareholder, because there can be no good that can come out of that. That's what activists will do. They will try to reach out to management separately. They'll try to reach out to board members, get them on the record. If there are divisions already that exist between management and the board, that's another reason why they're going to try to go and talk to board members. So you want to make sure the board knows what's happening and they're prepared and they're not going to say things to the activists that will be on the record and that they'll find their way into a fight letter and that will be in the news.
So Joe, now the activist capital makes a bunch of demands here, and I think the smart way to approach it is that you don't, as my wife always keeps telling me, don't shoot the source. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the activist is wrong with their demand. So I mean, what is the process and what is the legal standard when the board is evaluating demands like these, Joe?
Well, you know, as in all situations, whether it's an activist situation or any other situation, the board has to act in the best interest of the shareholders, all the shareholders, not just the activist shareholders. And there is no specific duty to engage with activist shareholders, and nor is there a duty or a responsibility of the board to alter their long-term strategy to satisfy short-term demands of activists. So you don't have a duty to talk to them or to respond to them. So you just tell them to go pound salt, right? Probably not. So while your board are going to be protected by generally the business judgment rule, what that means is that as crazy as these proposals may seem to a board, the board has got to listen to them, they've got to evaluate them, and they've got to make sure that the activists can't come back and say, well, this board was not acting in good faith, that this board wasn't conflicted, and that they acted on an informed basis. So you do have to figure out very quickly between the management team and the board, how are you going to look at these proposals? You can't just wave them aside, but you've got to be able to demonstrate that you have looked at them and that you've given them a fair consideration.
There's also some case law on this, and there was a little reported case last year, the PLX technology case. There's a short summary of the case is that PLX was in a proxy fight. The fight was primarily about, well, should the company be sold now, or is it the wrong time of the cycle? And so the activists made a very aggressive case for an immediate sale of the company. It was a proxy fight for minority board representation. The activists won the proxy fight. They got 3 members on the board. And 6 months later, the whole board agreed to sell the company, including the legacy directors. And, well, you know what happens in corporate America when you announce a public M&A deal? You get sued, right? So, and then during the inevitable litigation, what came out was that, well, the legacy directors continued to believe that this was a wrong time of the cycle to sell. But they caved because they were threatened with another proxy fight and they just had enough. And the judge, Vice Chancellor Lesser, said, well, that's just not good enough. Not wanting a proxy fight is not a good enough reason to cave to an activist. If you believe that their demands are destroying shareholder value, you are duty-bound to make a stand, whether you like it or not.
And there's a lot of pressure now on companies who are too quick to settle. It used to be kind of the opposite, that shareholders were interested in the company avoiding this because it is expensive and it's distracting, but I think we're seeing a lot more trend towards the other side of it, where people are criticizing early settlements.
If Kai, just allow me for 30 seconds to put my activist hat on. I think that the visceral reaction to contact by activists, by boards, is to be defensive and to be dismissive. That's just typically what happens. But it's rare that activists are knocking on the door of companies that have beat earnings for 17 straight quarters. So the reality is, if you've got an activist, there are probably some issues that you may be working on, but maybe not. And often, activism can be a catalyst for a board to do what they need to do the hard work of evaluating their strategy and making sure that they are driving long-term shareholder value. And now I take my activist hat off because it's giving me hives.
So Bob, I mean, going back to our mock proxy fight, should the board meet with the activist? And if so, who should actually go to the meeting?
Easy answer is absolutely. But with a caveat. First one is never go alone. Always take two people. Second one is prepare. And third one, the intent of going is to listen. It's not to solve the problem, but it's to listen. If you reach this point, you already have your team assembled. You have your counsel, you have your IR firm, and that group and the experience, and we relied on Kai a lot on this, is preparing the group to go to face the activists. If you can figure out what their issue is, you're in a lot better position to determine who should go, number one, and how to approach them. Who should go depends on the issue. On our activism fight, I went and I took the chair of the nominating and governance because of the specific issue, and I knew what the issue was. And we were already addressing it internally. But you also want to take, boards have different strengths and people have different strengths. And you know what they are. You don't want to take somebody who is going to hit the activist in the face and not sit there and listen and negotiate. And there are some people on the board who would do that. So you have to choose the right people and choose the issue that they're going to talk about. Caveat, generally an activist will not sign an NDA. So while the issue might be presented to you and you're sitting there saying, well, I'm already addressing that and I'm already addressing that and I'm already addressing that, and you want to scream at them, you can't. You sit there and listen, and you can't reveal that without that NDA. So the purpose is take the right people, take two people, and listen and learn what they want.
So Sydney, any golden rules when you are going into these meetings from a communications perspective? I guess don't spit into the activist's face is probably a good rule of thumb, but
Yes.
any others?
Yeah, Bob is right. You want to be open. You want to ask a lot of questions. So if they ask you a question, follow up with, what kind of analysis did you do to get to that point? Or what have you seen work in other situations? And really try to draw them into talking more than you. I do think competency in shareholder communications is something that should be considered as part of the board skills matrix. To Bob's point, there's some people who are going to shine at this and some who aren't, so be choosy about who you bring. I mean, your goal in this conversation is to establish a framework for continued dialogue, private dialogue with them, continued constructive dialogue. So the more you can be open to ideas and interested in learning their perspective, that's the tone you want to set in the meeting. In preparing for the meeting, you want to know, obviously, who they are, what issues they have on their mind, most likely. But also, what do your other shareholders think? If you can go into that meeting with the knowledge of generally what your shareholders think about your management team, about your strategy, about performance, then that's really helpful for you to have in the back of your head. We had one client that was in this situation, and one of the shareholders was, the activist shareholder was really pushing for a share buyback. And they had just completed a investor perception audit with an outside firm and had the knowledge, having surveyed their investors, that most investors thought that there were a lot of acquisition opportunities on the horizon and that they really wanted to keep the powder dry. So going into that meeting with a shareholder that's really pushing for the buyback, with that knowledge of what your shareholders really think about the company and strategy is really helpful to have as well. And then I think, to Bob's point, you can't over-prepare in terms of training for message delivery. So rehearse that meeting, rehearse your team and how to respond to tough questions. Because, Kai and I were joking yesterday, we've seen some clients with some pretty bad meetings, and that can really derail the situation.
Yeah, in fact, how Sydney and I approach these situations, we literally script out these meetings. You're putting together extensive Q&A for the tough questions that our clients can expect and the answers they should be giving.
But it never goes like that.
Fair enough.
Keep in mind in that, to expect the activist group to already have possibly reached out to your major institutional shareholders. So go in
Absolutely.
with that mindset.
The activists are looking for your board members to say the wrong thing. They're looking for sound bites. They're looking to create wedges between management and the board potentially. And also, I hate to say this, assume that they're recording the conversations.
Definitely.
And that's legal in some jurisdictions. Certainly, it's legal here. It may not be in others. But assume that they're recording it, and quotes may find their way into the public.
And that's why the way we approach these kind of meetings is we take our clients through the equivalent of a trial witness prep, a deposition prep, right? I mean, literally, we simulate the entire conversation with them. And oftentimes the clients tell us afterwards, well, the meeting was not remotely as bad as than talking to you. Which also my wife says, but that's a different story. So let's go into phase number 2. So now, obviously, we want to escalate things a little bit. So the private discussions don't really yield any friendliness. Activist Capital now goes ahead and they file a 13D disclosing a 9.8% stake in the company. Simultaneously, we see there's a 13D filing. They issue a public love letter, which includes everything but love. And they threaten openly to pursue a proxy fight unless the company kicks out the CEO and replaces him or her with Activist Capital's handpicked CEO candidate, gives the activist 3 board seats on the 9-member board, and formally commences the strategic review process, including an Activist Capital designee as chair of the board committee that is in charge of the review process. And well, stock price trades up pretty significantly, 12%, heavy trading volume, and the company receives dozens of calls from investors, the media, and probably also a couple of concerned whispers from employees. So, Joe, first things first, I mean, when a 13D is filed, is a target company legally required to respond in any form or fashion?
No.
Okay, so thank you. Shortest answer of the day.
And he prepped for that.
It's in my notes.
So Sydney, but are you at least well advised to respond publicly? And when do you not respond publicly in these kinds of situations?
Yes. If it's just a clean 13D and doesn't have any criticisms or letter attached to it, then I don't think you need to respond. But if it's a 13D with a letter attached and with specific recommendations for the board, yes. So at its heart, this is now a communications issue. Which side is going to articulate a more compelling vision for the company? So you've got to get your vision out there, right? And ideally, the company has been doing that as part of its normal course investor relations, but it's definitely time to turn up the volume on that now. Activism thrives when there's a disconnect between the story that you're telling shareholders and the story that shareholders are understanding. So we really want to bridge that as much as possible. But yes, definitely we want a public response. Ideally, the company, as part of its activism preparedness and activism deterrence work in advance of a fight, has already articulated these are each of our vulnerabilities, whether it's governance, performance, strategy, and they've written up, maybe with outside advisors, that response to each of those criticisms. So now we've got this public letter, we can plug it in and get our response out pretty quickly, rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper. We also, on the public response, we probably want to be talking with media, the financial media, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Reuters, those types of folks. Firms like ours talk with those reporters who are very specialized that cover activism and M&A. We want to shape their understanding of the situation as much as possible. So you won't see any fingerprints on that. It's not on the record statements, but we want to make sure that the stories that they're going to start running have our perspective. And finally, on the communications front, we want to keep our employees close. Need to make sure that they are feel as comfortable about this as possible. I know it's a stressful thing for an employee to have to go through a fight, and they see this fight letter that is saying all these terrible things about their company or their management or their board. So an employee letter or a town hall You might also consider some local media outreach. Get a nice piece in the local paper that talks about the company and its role in the community and that sort of thing to try to put some comfort around this.
So Bob, when you are a board member and you receive your email alert with a 13D filing, I mean, how should a board react when a 13D is filed?
If it's a normal 13D, add those folks to your list on your outreach program and include the board for the outreach program. If it's an activist, hopefully you've already formed your team. So what you have to do internally is your outside team, your outside consultants. So internally you have to name a couple people who are going to handle this activism. You can't have the whole board making every decision and being involved in everything. And it goes back to what I said earlier, choose the board members who are best suited for it and best suited for the issue of the activist.
One of the best pieces of advice I got early on in the process from Kai was, you've got to figure out who the board team is. Get one or two, not one or two, but two or three at the most, two is ideal, board members who are essentially going to be the go-to people, because once this thing starts, it becomes fast and furious, and you've got press releases, you've got fight letters, and you've got to be able to react and get statements out in that current news cycle. You can't do that if you need to go talk to 9 board members or 11 board members and get consensus on what the message is. So early on in the process, the board's got to figure out who the two folks, the go-to folks are, who are going to be able to bless whatever communications are going out during that process.
And oftentimes, it may sound strange, it's not necessarily the CEO. And I would, Kai, your experience, I don't know from a CEO if in fact they would be part of that team, but I would say generally not, because sometimes the issue could be the CEO, and you don't want to go into that with a defensive posture.
So what I get typically is from clients is, this is outrageous. I mean, these punks should be in jail. Do something, sue them. And so we are talking about defensive measures against activists. And then that's a really awkward conversation about the First Amendment of your otherwise great Constitution, that you can't really prohibit activists from criticizing the beloved CEO. And, but obviously, there are some legal things you can do to deal with activism. Number one, in my experience, 95% of the bylaws of corporate America are terrific during peacetime, but are not suited for proxy contests. That's because, well, when these companies IPO'd, some really overworked mid-level associate in Houston or New York pulled off a shelf at 2 a.m. in the morning, filled in the blanks, and these became the bylaws of the corporation. And they have never been reviewed by someone who has been through a couple of proxy fights. And you will find that a lot of sections that you've never read actually certainly present a problem or an opportunity if they are drafted the right way. So you want to have someone with proxy fight experience go through your bylaws and make a couple of changes. Most of the changes that I make, we have a list of like 45 things we look at, are around the margins that you wouldn't even think about, and ISS and Glass Lewis don't yell at you for those. But it really becomes important. And in an ideal world, you have already done this, but now is the last time you can consider that. I will tell you, though, that if you do make bylaw amendments while you're already under attack from an activist, there's higher scrutiny. So you need to be significantly more careful and surgical in your bylaw amendments after a public attack has launched than during peacetime.
Kai, can I mention this is, make sure as a director you look at the bylaws, you look at your charters, and make sure you understand how the voting goes. And I say that is, we had cumulative voting. And for those of you who don't know what cumulative voting is, you can ask the question. I'd be glad to answer it. But make sure you understand what cumulative voting is, because that's the easiest way an activist can get in and gain control of some board seats. That's a critical piece. If you have it, it's a shareholder vote to change it. I would suggest you do that to protect the company.
Very good advice. And let's go on to the next phase, phase number 3. So now Actors Capital goes ahead and submits a notice of its intent to nominate an opposing slate of directors, or what other people say, the nomination notice. And they want to replace now 5 directors of the 9-member board. And so they are specifically seeking control of the company, and they are targeting the CEO. And concurrently with the nomination notice, which is typically sent to you by email, fax, and messenger, at the same time, they amend the 13D and put out a public press release disclosing a stake increase. Now the activist is at 12%. And they issue another press release that announces the launch of the fight. And they also launch a website. And typically this website is, well, in this case, makeamericagreatagain.com, or your company sucks, but I know how to fix it.com. And then you receive another letter from the attorneys, and they demand a shareholder list. So it's a lot of things to talk about here. Let's start with the nomination notice. So, Joe, what is the legal significance of the nomination notice?
And just going back to what you were talking about a few moments ago, if you've got well-drafted bylaws, they will have a provision that requires nominations to be made within certain windows prior to the meeting, 60 to 90 days or maybe 90 to 120 days. I think Kyle will tell you that there have been situations where he's had companies that didn't have that provision properly drafted. So you want to make sure before you get the notice that the windows are adequate. All that this notice really means is that they've now disclosed who their proposed nominees are. That notice is going to have a lot of information about their holdings, about who the players are, who's involved. So you'll learn quite a bit more about who your activists are in that notice. But as a practical matter, it doesn't mean that they're going to go forward and put these folks on the ballot. It just means that if they do, these are the folks that are on. They can't later on, after the window closes, change their nominees, but they can withdraw them. But the other thing here is it's a final opportunity to have your advisors, have your legal team look at this notice carefully, because it's a technical document. There are a lot of ways that the activists can screw it up. And the best thing that could happen is if they screw it up really badly and I get a call from Kai and he says, hey, they're done. They can't nominate because they didn't prepare it properly. So it's a document that you really need to have looked over very carefully by counsel.
Yeah, in fact, we won 3 proxy fights in the last 5 years because the activists made a crucial mistake in the nomination notice. And they literally never got out of the locker room. So Bob, I mean, here the activist proposes a slate, a controlled slate, to replace a majority of the board. What difference does it make to the board whether the activist goes for board control or minority representation?
From the board perspective, there's probably a greater incentive or impetus to fight if they want control, because you don't want to give up control and you believe you're doing the right thing. Or maybe that's their negotiating ploy, that they're willing to take 2 or 3 seats out of 9 or 10, but you don't know. But you're going to fight it. From the perspective of gaining control, one of the keys, and we'll get to that later, is particularly if you have an institutional investor base, what does ISS say? And ISS has a tendency, if somebody's looking for total control and a complete changeover, probably more reluctant to do that because it's so disruptive. So you might have a leg up on a complete control, but again, that may be just a negotiating ploy by the activists.
Remember, this is all based upon whether you're a company with a staggered board or not a staggered board. If you've got a staggered board, activists aren't going to be able to go seek control, because the only directors they can replace are those that are up. And this is an interesting area because the trend for most of the larger companies in America have gone away from staggered boards. It's not something that ISS or Glass Lewis or any of the folks out there are advocating. So If you are a company that still has a staggered board, that's great, because that'll help you out in terms of not being vulnerable to activists trying to take control. However, it is going to get you dinged when ISS and Glass Lewis look at your governance because they don't like it.
That's very, very good points. So, Sydney, I mean, here the activist is targeting the CEO explicitly, and historically activists have been pretty shy about doing that. Is that sentiment changing, and why is that the case?
Yes, it definitely is. It used to be that activists would say, let me onto the board so I can check out how management's doing over the course of the year, and then they'll make a decision on whether they like the CEO or not. Now we're seeing a lot more fights go straight to the CEO. Those could be directly, the CEO is on the ballot, or they could just be criticism and pressure to try to kick out the CEO outside of the formal proxy process. I think there's several reasons for that. A lot of the fights we're seeing right now are very operations focused, as opposed to governance or financial engineering, in part because a lot of those governance vulnerabilities have been addressed already. So now you're seeing activists come out with very sophisticated operational recommendations for the company, and so they really want the CEO's attention to those issues. We also are seeing a big focus on corporate culture from the activists. Nelson Peltz went after Procter Gamble, and he said that they had an insular culture, and we see it also on the Nestle fight with Dan Loeb. He says that their culture is slow-moving, and so I think now that they're more attuned to the role that corporate culture plays in the organization's performance, they're more attuned to the CEO's role as well. I think it's a hard ask to say to shareholders, hey, vote out your CEO because you need a CEO. So we're also seeing a lot of activists actually recommending or proposing CEOs so that there's someone in line waiting so that shareholders have more comfort in voting the CEO out. But I mean, if you just look at the numbers, I was thinking about this last night. I mean, there's AIG, GE, Arconic, CSX, Pandora, Buffalo Wild Wings, Avon Tenet, Granite REIT, Mondelez. Those are just a few of the ones I came up with off the top of my head of CEOs who have lost their jobs in the last year alone because of activists.
Well, Arconic, the CEO was a German, so I understood the shareholder unrest there.
We actually, my first meeting with my activist group, they brought their proposed CEO. And I wasn't sure of the intent, but I guess I was going to interview them. I don't know. It was really weird.
So here in the fact pattern, all the activist has crossed the 10% threshold. That is actually significant because that then puts the board into a very difficult position to decide whether or not to adopt a poison pill. So what does it mean? Most of you know that a poison pill is a legal instrument that the board can adopt unilaterally without shareholder approval overnight. That puts a cap at the amount of shares that any one shareholder can buy. And the modern poison pill typically has a 10% threshold. So you don't want to adopt a poison pill as long as the activist is below 10%, because then you're just adopting a poison pill, but it doesn't really serve any purpose because the activist might very well stay below 10%. And most activists stay below 10%. Why is that? The answer is Section 16 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. In plain English, what Section 16 says is if you own more than 10% of the company and you buy and sell shares within a 6 months time period, you need to disgorge, you need to hand over your hard-earned profits to the very company that you are harassing. That's the last thing an activist wants to do. But if an activist goes and buys more than 10%, that means they are here to stay. They are not here to cut and run. They're here to stay. And so then you need to make a judgment call with the help of your advisors. Does this activist have the financial firepower, willingness, and interest in acquiring an even larger stake, 15, 20, or 25%? Why does this matter? Well, any proxy solicitor will tell you it makes a huge difference whether you fight a proxy fight against a 10% shareholder or a 25% shareholder. Essentially, every share that the activist buys is a vote you already lost. You also know that not 100% turnout is common at shareholder meetings. Typically, you have 80, 95% turnout. So in many proxy fights, about 40% of the outstanding carries the vote at the annual meeting. So to allow an activist to buy up a large position means essentially that you lost the fight. So you're in a difficult spot. You know you get yelled at when you adopt the poison pill, and a lot of shareholders will scream, you shouldn't do this. ISS and Glass Lewis are not going to send you roses either. But at the same time, if you don't do it and you have an activist who is willing to buy 20%, he might just be able to dictate you the terms of surrender. So it's a very difficult judgment call. Then one last thing here from a legal perspective. So what you receive always is a demand for the shareholder list. That's because, as I noted earlier, the SEC filings don't necessarily show the fully accurate picture of the actual shareholders. And the company typically has better data because you can order what is called a NOBO list from your brokers, get a better sense of who actually the ultimate shareholders are. The activist wants to have the same data. That is in particular important when you have fights with a lot of retail shareholders. Because, well, just in like in political elections, you need to know your electorate in order to run a campaign. So now let's go into the final phase before we get thrown off the stage. So now we have the proxy fight commencing. Both parties file their proxy materials. The proxy materials also include some inaccuracies. Both parties start, after they go definitive, they go and start sending out fight letters to the shareholders. 3 weeks prior to the meeting, each party meets with ISS. You also have maybe a phone call with Glass Lewis, although oftentimes they don't take calls, and Egan-Jones. And then about 2 weeks prior to the meeting, then the advisory firms issue their recommendations. And in our fact pattern, ISS, surprise, surprise, supports the entire slate of the activists. Glass Lewis recommends voting on your card, but they have some reservations about 2 of your directors and withhold on those. And Egan-Jones supports the entire slate. So since we don't have much time, let's go quickly through the most important things. So Sydney, so what are, in a proxy fight, the most important campaign materials and communication methods?
So there's many materials put together. Fight letters. The content and the format of the letters is really going to depend on who your shareholder base is. For example, if you've got a lot of retail, you probably need a lot of graphics and visuals and need it to be punchy. If you've got a lot of institutional shareholders, you can have it a little bit more sophisticated. Talking points for conversations with shareholders, those really need to be catered to each shareholder. So as you're out talking with your holders, some are going to be really focused on governance issues. Some are going to really want to hear a growth story. Some are really going to want to hear something else. And so you need to share a consistent message, but it also needs to be catered to each shareholder. So talking points, employee communications, again, this is very disruptive and uncomfortable. In the course of, you're also running the business, of course, so you've got regular earnings materials, conference attendance. Each of those kind of normal course investor relations activities is an opportunity to start weaving in more and more of the company narrative that's particularly appropriate for this fight. So take a fresh look at your normal IR stuff as well. We put together a deck for the ISS and Glass Lewis meetings. And that's a big focus of time in preparing in a fight. It's got to be sharp, but it also has to be comprehensive because you've got to anticipate and address anything that ISS could raise, but you usually have about 30 minutes to get through that. So the deck is a big focus, and then planning for the meeting. So again, training the company and how to stay on message and how to address some of the tough questions. Finally, I'd mentioned the proxy statement. Traditionally it's a legal disclosure document, but more and more we're seeing companies look at it as a communications vehicle, as an actual document that's read by somebody. And I think, especially in a fight, but even in peacetime, I really like this trend towards seeing it as a communications document, aligning it, the messaging in it with the normal course investor relations messaging, building out a lot more on governance and board skills and those sorts of things. So take a fresh look at your proxy, whether you're in a fight or not. I think it can be a real tool that's not used to its full extent right now by most companies. And then media relations. Some of these fights are pretty high profile. Again, in one case, for example, Carl Icahn, we heard that he was going on CNBC to talk about his vision for our company, our client. And we were able to call CNBC and say, talk to David Faber and say, Icahn's about to come on. Here's some holes that we see in his strategy. Ask him kind of a line of questioning along this way. And we kind of blew his interview, right? He said at one point in the CNBC interview, he said, what is this, a deposition? So, if we can kind of shape the media coverage like that, all the better.
Terrific, terrific.
And Kai, one quick thing, and it ties to what Sydney's saying. The amount of time that's going to be required by the directors who are part of this process. There are an enormous number of shareholder meetings, Glass Lewis. It requires an enormous amount of prep, and that's why you need a small director team who's designated. But it is hours and hours of time, unlike any other responsibilities that you've had as directors. So it's important to understand that there's a big commitment here, and directors and the management team need advisors to help them. The statements and the message you make to Glass Lewis and to ISS and the shareholders, as Sydney said, it's a little bit different. You can't just have one message and spit it out to each of these meetings. It's got to be nuanced. Really requires good advisors and good preparation.
So what is the role of the proxy advisory firms in a proxy contest, and what is the role of the board in these meetings from your perspective?
Well, I think we talked a lot about that, but number one, understand your shareholder base. If you are primarily institutional, obviously the role of ISS and Glass Lewis is absolutely critical. In my experience, there is an expectation that the board will present their position to, I happen to do it with ISS, and they'll get the other side. And again, it's just the team is critical, and it's not necessarily addressing what the proxy fight issues are, it's addressing your plan for the company. And we did not do it in person. Oftentimes it's done in person. We did it by phone and spent about an hour and a half. And at the end of the conversation, I thought, oops, they're going the other side. So they don't give any indication which way they're leaning. The other side had the same benefit. And the next day, we got an email from ISS saying, we're supporting management's proposal. Thanks to the prep and not the individuals. We had the CEO and myself. The CEO is critical for the plan, even if it's a proxy fight against the CFO for removal. He's got to lay out the vision of the company too. But make sure that everybody is on the same team, your team. Make sure the board is consistent, make sure the CEO is consistent, and you deliver the same message. Because if you don't, you're going to lose.
So oftentimes we see, obviously, in proxy fights, things that we don't like to read about our clients. Now, in my experience, proxy fights are not remotely as nasty as political campaigns. Mostly they're about business. The average voter in a proxy contest in corporate America is maybe also slightly more sophisticated than the average voter in political elections, although not everyone feels about BlackRock that way. And But what you still see is oftentimes campaign materials that you think are misleading or incendiary, and then the question I always get from clients, what can we do about it? Can't we just sue these bastards? And the answer is yes, we could, because one of the most notable differences between political elections and corporate director elections is that there are rules. And you have actually someone who enforces those rules. You have the courts and you have the SEC. So the question is, whom do you go to enforce the rules when you think that the activist is not playing by the rules, the proxy rules in particular, who fairly specifically prohibit certain conduct, such as you cannot predict that you're winning the election. You cannot disparage the reputation of directors without a foundation. And you would think this is the very essence of a proxy fight, right? But that's why you hardly see direct personal attacks. But if to the extent you see material that you think is misleading, and we see it all the time, then the question always is, okay, do we go to court or do we go to the SEC? And in most cases, the answer is we rather go to the SEC and not the court. Why is that? That's because most institutional investors, ISS and Glass Lewis, they frown upon companies suing their own shareholders. So unless you have an open and shut case that basically ends the proxy fight, you should be very, very careful about going to court, because you might win the court battle, but you might lose the votes at the ballot box because you alienated everyone who matters by going to a judge.
And the PR battle.
That is a PR battle. And then, so the alternative is then you go to the SEC, and that's what we mostly do. We work behind the scenes. We are sending private complaints to the SEC. We call them bedbug letters or poison pen letters, where we basically are begging the SEC to step in and instruct the activists to tone down the rhetoric and not make certain statements again. Sometimes we get the SEC even so riled up in a proxy fight a couple of years ago against Endeavor International. We got the SEC so riled up that they told the activists, you cannot go definitive, you cannot even continue with your proxy fight until and unless you recant the following 12 statements in the proxy statement. So, so there are ways to do it, and the good thing about the poison pen or bedbug letters is, well, they are confidential, so you're not getting screamed at for nitpicking by the media and the activists and ISS and Glass Lewis, because it's behind the scenes.
As a practical matter, though, I would, Kai, tell me if you agree, that route, the conduct has to be pretty egregious. The SEC is not going to get involved on sort of minor kinds of things. So we're really talking about where the activists have really gone past what's fair and appropriate.
Yeah, no, that's right. And typically, the SEC doesn't require an activist to recant. They just tell them, don't do it again. And you see that the same phrases in the next fight letter will be softened. So, last thing. So, Joe, I mean, we have here at the end of the fight, oftentimes you have, again, settlement negotiations. And in fact, you typically have settlement negotiations behind the scenes throughout the entire fight, throughout the entire situation, sometimes going on for 9 months. And but now that the ISS, Glass Lewis, and Egan Jones came out, oftentimes the forces of compromise are strong again. So the question is, just generally speaking, and when do you choose to fight or continue the fight, and when do you settle?
Well, if you have advisors like Kai, you don't ever settle because you know you're going to win. This is a tough one. Proxy fights are enormously expensive. They're enormously consuming, not just for the management team, but for the board as well. So there's always, throughout this entire process, you always have to be thinking, should I settle or should I not settle? One thing I will say is, even if it's not a battle over control, even if the settlement is, well, we'll put 2 of their guys on, we'll replace a couple of our directors. While that may seem innocuous enough, 1 or 2 new directors in the boardroom can have a dramatic effect on the dynamics of a board to the negative. So you really have to be mindful about what the consequences are of allowing folks who force their way onto your board. So it's every case is different. There's one dynamic though that is present. Activists would almost always rather settle than go through, even if they know they're going to win. And the reason is that if they settle, they can dictate some of the terms, like they're going to get representation on certain committees, on an audit committee or on a strategic direction committee. If they simply win at the election and they get their guys on the board, they don't have any way of making sure that they're on whatever committees they want to be on. So there's an incentive on their side to settle and dictate some of the terms of.
Well, and from the company perspective, settlement's usually going to include a standstill, and that's pretty attractive to know that you're not going to be faced with the same thing next year, at least by these particular activists.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, as it relates to cost, good portion of your proxy fight cost might be covered by D&O insurance. There are creative arguments you can make with insurance carriers to convince them to foot some of the bill. And ironically, it's easier to convince carriers for the larger amount of the bill, if you have a settlement with a release. That is something I'm happy to explain in more detail, but it actually is helpful.
That's a great point. I just want to say, I read our D&O policy, and my initial read was that we really weren't covered for this. Kai said, let me have one of my guys look at it. And lo and behold, another look, you'd be surprised. And if you're aggressive and you push the carriers, you can find some dollars out of your D&O, which after what you're going to spend on a proxy contest is pretty helpful.
And always negotiate your advisor bill. Sorry, Kai.
I'm very incentivized to find ways to make insurance carriers pay for me, yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about advanced preparation. So you think everything is fine, everything is just great, no activist would never have a reason to target your company, or at least that's what you believe. So what do you do in peacetime? So Sydney, from a IR perspective, PR perspective, what should a company do during peacetime?
Well, we could have a whole program about this topic. Basically, even if you win the fight, the wheels of change are starting to turn. And so the best way to come out ahead is to avoid the fight altogether, and the best defense is a really top-notch IR program. So plug for your IR people, really invest in understanding what they're doing and what feedback they're getting and what the trends are in IR, because ideally you avoid the fight altogether. Of course, that doesn't always happen. I mentioned doing a perception audit of your investor base so that you know what that sentiment is on the outset. Talk to IR, ask them what questions are being asked. Think about the logistics. Make sure that you have the infrastructure in place so that if a call comes in and maybe it's not one of the big name activists, do you have the process in place to identify that red flag for IR to elevate it internally in the appropriate way? So there's a lot of process stuff you can be thinking about on the outset. I think it's helpful when companies have evaluated a range of strategic alternatives outside of the board strategy, so that we can say in a fight, yes, the activist wants us to do X, Y, Z, and we fully evaluated that, and here's the 10 reasons why it's not appropriate for our company. So the more the board can do to look into alternatives in advance of a fight, that definitely helps us on the message front. Clearly, there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of board diversity. If you have a poison pill or staggered board, no activist, well, few activists care about these issues because of the goodness of their heart. But they're sure going to exploit it and use it as a foot in the door. So clean up whatever low-hanging fruit there is. I would also mention start weaving in some language about your ESG issues and commitment and really governance stuff into your investor relations materials proactively, because you know that those are going to be, ISS is going to be attuned to those types of things, for example. So start talking about them more proactively in your normal course IR. Also play up more of your corporate culture and what you're doing on that front. I mentioned looking at the proxy as a communications vehicle, and then prepare defenses for all of the vulnerabilities. So you've mapped out, these are the things we could get dinged for. Here's how we can talk about those things a little bit more proactively now in the absence of a fight to anticipate and address them proactively. And here's some language that we can use if we need to use it defensively. So if we've got to get a letter out in response pretty quickly, we've already mapped out all the thinking and the language there.
Very helpful, very helpful. And Joe, from a legal perspective, what do you wish you should have done during peacetime?
Well, I think governance. If you haven't done a robust review of your governance, you need to do it and go home tonight and, well, after the parade, and do it. Well, good companies are doing that. They're constantly looking at their governance. I can't overstate that. The other thing, similar, what is sort of related, is if you're a board and it's all men over the age of 72 and they've all been on the board for 15, 20 years, if there are no women, you've got to really look at diversity. You've got to look at entrenchment. You've got to look in the mirror and say, are we really the kind of board that ISS and Glass Lewis and the shareholder world respect? And it's going to require some tough decisions for boards to make. But all of that governance stuff is, if you do it beforehand, you will reduce your vulnerability many times over.
Okay, Bob, final word before we get cut off.
Quick final word about what's important. Reach out to your shareholder base. That's critical. And I know the NACD and the annual conference talked about who should reach out. Involve the board to reach out because they want to hear what the investors are saying, but make sure they're prepared.
One last thing, if you want to have a checklist on what the best practices of advanced preparation are for shareholder activism, it's slide 8 of the little leave behind that we have at the entrance. So with that, I thank everyone for your patience. I have a couple of questions here, but I know I don't get the time to ask them, so I'm happy to answer them privately afterwards.
Kai, my name is David Prang, chairman of the chapter. We had a dinner last night with the speakers. They said this could go for 2.5 hours, and I think you could see it was right. Let us thank Kai, Sydney, Bob, and Joe for a great program.